Welcome to our World Water Day event 2022. On behalf of the Council of Canadians Edmonton chapter, I'd like to thank you very much for coming out. My name is Richard Mary, and I am using notes, so I'll be putting my head down. I've been around with the chapter for about 13 years, and we are all volunteers, so hopefully you'll bear with some of the imperfections. I'm here because I want to learn more about the status of Alberta's fresh water towards appreciating it and protecting it. Our event entitled Alberta's Fresh Water, Do We Take It for Granted? We have three questions. Why do we and should we love and respect Alberta's fresh water? What are the threats, secondly, to the fresh water? And what can we do to ensure sustained protection of our fresh water? Water is an extremely large and complex topic, so we're focusing on three Alberta watersheds that are storing and delivering the water. The North Saskatchewan, the Sturgeon, and the Athabasca River. One of our speakers will focus on human health and water. In any case, just for your information, the Sturgeon River is part of the North Saskatchewan River watershed. The event overview, we hope in about 10 minutes here to start with our speakers. We have five in total, excellent speakers who have offered their time here and their hard work to extend that to you. So hopefully you'll have a notebook ready and take some notes. I believe this session will be recorded, so you'll be able to get more on it another time. So we've got speakers for each of the watersheds, and I'll introduce them later. I think you saw that on the mail out. The last part, after about 8:15, we'll talk about the Edmonton chapter and what we're planning to be doing in the future on this and other issues. And there will be time for Q&A, about 10 minutes for each speaker, about 5 minutes for Q&A and 10 minutes presentation, but at about 8:25. So we really hope you could stick around for this hard-won event here. Thank you so much for coming out. Now we want to try something a little different this time, rather than just a lot of facts and figures, to try to bring you into your own experience with Alberta's fresh water. And to that end, what we're going to ask you to do, and we'll be looking on the chat soon, is to just tell us your little story about your good experiences with Alberta's fresh water, and why you value it. Could be anything. Maybe keep it to 50 words if you can, and just whatever, anything that expresses your feelings. Personally, I remember as a young person growing up in the Fort Saskatchewan area, on Sunday afternoon we'd go over to the Sturgeon River, runs into the North Saskatchewan, and having picnics and fishing and swimming, and it was just a really good time. And I'd come from BC originally, so I was really happy to see some water I could swim in. I recall, though, in fact, that the depth and the width of that river at that time, that was in the 60s, was quite a bit more than it is right now. And so, this is part of what I want to find out tonight is, why that has happened. And not sure we'll have all the answers. The volume is less, the width is probably half as much at most. So I hope that you'll be able to write your little story in the chat. Again, unfortunately, can't do this orally, but that would be really helpful to our cause here, and maybe bring you into just imagine yourself sitting down there or walking along the river or canoeing or whatever else you were doing. Why do you love the water? I'm going to show you a few slides, and after that, we'll have Carolina and Mackenzie from the University of Alberta, who have offered their time to receive your stories. and to just read them. And hopefully this will bring us into the larger conversation coming up from our speakers. Before I do anything more, so you could start putting those little stories in right now, just some brief memories you're willing to share. We do have something we all need to remember, and that is that we are on, Indigenous treaty territories, and that Indigenous people have shared the rivers that we're going to talk about, have used the rivers, have lived on the rivers for thousands of years, and so we want to offer our respect for that, and thanks that we are also sharing in that good fortune. So before I show a few slides here, I think Christina is going to mention some little technical details that might be of value. Christina, do you have something you would like to say?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I just wanted to let folks know we would really welcome you to share your stories, as Richard has been talking about in the chat. If you do have any questions that are specifically for our speakers, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or it should be on one of the sides if you're on a Mac. So if you click on that, there's an opportunity for you to enter a question to any of the speakers. So we would encourage you to take advantage of that function as well. If you are having any technical issues, I've put my email here as my username on Zoom. So please feel free to email me, and I'm happy to help troubleshoot with you. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and really looking forward to learning from our speakers and all of you folks as well this evening.
Okay, I see I think we're getting a few stories here, and I'm really excited about that. I did want to just run through a couple of slides here before I bring Carolina and Mackenzie on. And you'll have seen the first one of the topic, but hopefully that's the first photo here is all familiar to you. This is the Athabasca River near Jasper. What can we say about our heritage? It's absolutely gorgeous, and we're thankful to have it and want to protect it. And Paul Belanger is going to talk about what's happening downstream that we need to keep an eye on. In the rest of the world, as you all know, people don't take water for granted, and I've seen this firsthand, mostly women and children carrying great amounts of water on their head just to have something to drink every day. Closer to home in Canada, we have some similar problems. First Nations people have been getting the rough end of the stick on water treatment, and this is a result of some of that. There are some 35 um, water advisories on First Nations still in Canada. There might be more than that. Sorry if I'm not correct on that, but there are quite a few. So it's still an issue. I just wanted to give you an overview of the watersheds in Alberta, and of course our focus will be on these two watersheds here, including the Athabasca, the Sturgeon River included in the North Saskatchewan. The Athabasca River itself, this is from the World Wildlife Fund, and they're talking about the quality of the status is good in terms of the flow, but it's declining. The flow is declining. In fact, it's gone down something like 20% since the 60s overall. I'm not a scientist, so this is from the World Wildlife Fund, and I don't want to pretend that I am. We've had chlorine spills upriver from here in 2018, always kind of shoved under the rug. You don't hear about it much. Just west of Drayton Valley. And selenium is the big issue over the last little while with the coal mines, and samples are still very high. This is January 25th, 2021 from Dr. Bill Donahue, formerly with the Alberta Environment. Right here in Edmonton, everybody has seen the refinery. I wonder what's going into the river from there, the Esso refinery. This is a so-called reclaimed tailings pond, or not tailings pond, but aggregate mine up in the Sturgeon. It doesn't look very reclaimed to me, but Mike and Ian will talk about that. And this is getting back to my little personal story, what the Sturgeon River looks like at the just around St. Albert. It's about 100 feet wide there. And I took this picture the other day entering the North Saskatchewan. It's probably 20 feet wide, so you can see what I'm talking about. I do love the river. And our final picture here is one of our members here, Brian, who's somewhere around there. And we did a little trip on the North Saskatchewan west of the Henday Bridge. So I do love the rivers, and there's some little ducks there that do use the river as their home. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to move on to Carolina and Mackenzie, who are students from the U of A, and I'll maybe let them see if they've managed to introduce themselves briefly, and pick out some stories and read them out to us. Let's hear how people feel about the rivers. So if you could unmute Carolina and Mackenzie, that'd be great. And I'll just leave the scene here for now.
Yeah, well, thanks everybody for coming today. We really appreciate it. And, thanks Richard and Christina for kind of setting the grounds for everything. I guess I'll start with first introducing myself. I'm Mackenzie, and I'm a third-year business and economics and law student at the U of A this year. And I'm here today because I'm super interested in kind of like government policy and the environmental side of that policy. So yeah, I'm super excited that I've been able to work with the Council of Canadians this year, and kind of why I'm helping host this event here today. I guess I can quickly talk about a little story myself, and then I'll pass it over to Lena, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the chats or some of the messages in the chat. But I myself grew up in Red Deer, actually. And all I can remember growing up in Red Deer, a lot of the time is spent, especially in the summer, is on the Red Deer River. I think a lot of the people that were in the chat mentioning the Red Deer River, I think it's like pretty common, like the tubing down the river during the summer. I've done that many times. And again, I've camped and I've kayaked and canoed down the river with my family. And I think just overall, when I think of Red Deer, I think a defining characteristic of our community is the Red Deer River. So it's just really great that all of us can kind of develop such good memories there. And yeah, I think just the Red Deer River has a huge place in my heart, and I can't wait to help out, making sure that it stays protected. And I'm super grateful, for all the guest speakers that are here today. So I'll pass it off to Lena now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mackenzie. So like she mentioned and Richard mentioned, my name is Carolina Lena. I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Alberta under the Environmental and Conservation Sciences program. I didn't grow up in Alberta, but I have had a chance to live in Edmonton for a few years now. And the North Saskatchewan River has become a big part of my life. Not only is it a great learning environment in my program, in like plant or soil ID, but I feel like it has provided a place to develop some of my closest friendships. So my friends and I typically like to go out on walks or get some fresh air, which getting fresh air is kind of tough in the city. So I appreciate that the space that the North Sask River provides. And yeah, I would love the chance to create more memories. And like Mackenzie said, I appreciate the speakers bringing awareness to not only the North Sask River, but all the other watersheds that we have here in Alberta. I think we're good to start sharing some of the stories that you guys have posted in the chat. Just looking here, Mackenzie, we can alternate. Yeah, the first one, I think really quick, Edna mentioned thinking of all the canoeing, kayaking that I have done. Absolutely, always a blast.
Yeah, and then there was another one about the water not only helps protect human life, but it also helps protect nature and wildlife and provides mental health value like nothing else. And they also mentioned that they studied at the Royal Roads University in Victoria and has spent so much time de-stressing by the ocean Pacific, by creeks, and the Pacific Ocean. I would always go to Vancouver a lot growing up, and visiting the ocean. I never grew up around it, but it's really nice. Like it makes you kind of appreciate what you're missing out on. So we totally get that. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Betty also said So appreciate fresh drinking water. Also enjoy recreational activities on the water. Absolutely. In the past, we have loved canoeing adventures on the waters. So healthy to be outdoors and enjoy nature around us, animals on the water. Yeah, that's definitely a point that not a lot of people talk about. Just like being out in like near water just feels like such a good time. So absolutely, Betty.
And then, yeah, next we talk about how we, somebody mentioned how we take water for granted, and especially as a gardener, they are super happy when it rains beautiful water. Yes, my grandma's a huge gardener and I always helped her growing up, and I think that's her hallelujah.
Yeah. Barb also said, like Mackenzie, Red Deer River, and riding horses at the Yahatinda west of Sudre. I'm so sorry if I'm butchering that. Every year since 1980, River has changed its channels many times. Absolutely, yeah. Wow, 1980. So many memories.
And then next we have one that they've lived in Calgary for 22 years and originally from the UK. Growing up, they were taught that Canada was famous for our fresh water, and that's how they became concerned and involved with the concerned citizens of Quiznell Lake. Sorry if I'm totally butchering that, after Canada's worst mining disaster in 2014. But they do value all Canadian water, of course. Yeah, terrible disaster. But yeah, it's nice to see that you're getting involved. It's really good.
Yeah. Dennis also mentioned working in irrigation for 50 years. Water is vital to this important industry. Yeah, I would love to hear more about like the experiences and knowledge that you've acquired in the industry. Yeah.
We have another one, how they took, again, canoeing, great pastime here in Alberta, but specifically canoeing on the Sturgeon River. They didn't go very far, but they really enjoyed seeing, yeah, I guess like the animals. I think it's like important to obviously talk about the water and protection of that, but also it plays into like the ecosystems around it and in it. So yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, Paula mentioned canoeing Alberta rivers, the Red Deer, Clearwater, Christina, North and South Saskatchewan, Athabasca. Wow, yeah, lots of experiences there. I'm sure each one of them is different in its own way.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much. We have to move on now. I'm sure you'd rather continue to listen to Lena and Mackenzie, and they're so much better looking than me as well. But anyhow, I just want to mention that Corrine is a member of the Council of Canadians Edmonton chapter. I'm glad to hear that Corrine has slipped sturgeon. Didn't go very far. It's probably because it's full of sticks and what have you. In any case, we do need to move on to our speakers. And, you know, if you want to share amongst yourselves, I think you can, you know, maybe make some connections amongst yourselves. And we will continue these chats as is possible. Meantime, I just want to thank you for doing that and continue to share your stories. That's really, really entertaining. Okay, thank you very much. I don't know whether I still got share screen on, but I should probably turn that off.
No, you're good.
Okay. In any case, I want to introduce our first speaker is Chris Smith, and Chris is from works with the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. I'm not going to go through his whole bio again. I'm sure you've all seen it on the invitation that we sent out. And if Chris wants to say any more about himself, he's a hardworking guy, I know, and has worked. He's been in many worlds, including the industrial world, and so he sort of has a very broad perspective. But he works with the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society in Edmonton. I'll just leave it at that, Chris. If you want to take it away and go for it, you've got 15 minutes. We're a little behind. Sorry, other speakers, but hopefully you can stick around.
Yeah, thanks for that, Richard. Here we go. So hi, everybody. As Richard said, my name's Chris Smith, and I'm a conservation analyst with the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society's Northern Alberta chapter, based out of Edmonton on Treaty 6 territory. Today, I'll be talking to you about the North Saskatchewan River watershed, and we'll be touching on why our watershed is so critical, what are some of the threats that it's currently facing and may face, and we'll end off on how concerned citizens can get involved with helping shape policy around water here in Alberta. So why is water important? So of course, our bodies need water to survive. If we don't have it, we're not alive. But we also use it for recreation, on top of bathing and washing and cooking and gardening and an endless number of other daily activities we do that rely on water. But also our economy needs water. In 2013, Alberta's GDP was $330 odd billion. And much of the economic activity generated by that GDP required water as some form of input, either directly or indirectly. Sectors like energy, manufacturing, forestry, agriculture, tourism, and many more together make up more than 50% of Alberta's GDP and all require water as inputs. But it's not just about humans either. Water is also the lifeblood of all living things and provides critical habitat for the province's wildlife. We must remember that we share this precious resource with many others beyond just ourselves. So essentially, headwaters are the tributaries, creeks, streams, rivers, and groundwater that contribute to the downstream flow of water across a landscape that eventually give us the major rivers and lakes that we know. In Alberta, there are 7 major watersheds shown here on the map. It's a bit better descriptors. And essentially, these 7 major watersheds dictate when the water falls on a piece of land, essentially where that water will end up based upon the geography, geology, and topography of the land. However, all the small branches eventually come together into a sort of single large trunk or like major river, which each gives the watershed their name. So for example, the North Saskatchewan River watershed is named from the North Saskatchewan River, which is the major water tributary that runs through it. The third map here is a precipitation map, and you can see the dark blue represents the highest rainfall amounts, annual rainfall amounts, and the red is the lowest. You'll notice that the highest rainfall amounts are kind of congregated in the southwest of the province, kind of along the Rocky Mountain chain there. And it's in this area where the source waters for 4 of our 7 major watersheds come from. Also where that kind of in the middle map, that looped line is representative of sort of the source water for those major rivers. So the importance of the Rockies for the provision of water across the Canadian prairies stretches back more than 100 years. It's long been known that this area of the country is crucial for the provision of water across not just Alberta, but all of the prairies and into the Northwest Territories. However, in recent times, a number of factors have been coming together that have been and will have significant influence on the hydrology of Alberta. So one example is that the average annual temperature in southern Alberta has gone up by 1.5 to 2 degrees and by 2 to over 3 degrees in northern Alberta since the 1950s. While Alberta's winters specifically have warmed on average 4 to 5 degrees in the south and by 6 to 7 degrees in the north. So Alberta, while it is expected to see further warming, has already experienced quite a bit already within the last century. We also have more directly human-driven influences at the local level in the form of river dams. So for the North Saskatchewan, we have 2 major ones, the Brazeau and the Bighorn dams further upstream. But we also have increasing human water withdrawals from these rivers, as well as increasing industrial pressure on the foothills and alpine areas of a province, mainly through forestry, mining, and oil and gas. So while this increasing industrial disturbance, why it matters is because things like intact forested landscapes help slow down the flow of water during high rainfall events. They help trap sediment before they enter the water, which greatly helps a lot of aquatic organisms. And they help regulate the local hydrological cycle through evapotranspiration of vegetation. While removing small amounts of forest cover generally isn't too harmful, depending on the scale, the impacts of multiple different industries compounded when you take forestry on top of mining, on top of oil and gas, on top of recreation, this starts to have cumulative impacts that really start to harm the capacity of that watershed to retain water on the land. So headwaters, why do we care? So sort of the key reasons that have been highlighted, the provision of crucial water for drinking and along with many of our day-to-day activities, the provision of critical habitat for a lot of wildlife species and plants, abundant recreational opportunities, which we've definitely noticed during COVID when we had unprecedented usage of these areas during the past 2 summers, and the mitigation of flooding and drought, both which are of potential issues and historic issues in Alberta. So what gets us from the headwaters, a place that's many hundreds of kilometers away from any of the large cities, metropolitan cities in Alberta, but have a huge influence on what happens in them, because ultimately we all need water and we all need a source of water. So water yields and usage. So more than 88% of the water that ends up in the North Saskatchewan comes from the headwaters area that's in the Bighorn Backcountry, West Country, David Thompson corridor area. While currently only a relatively small proportion of the North Saskatchewan River is currently allocated for human use, you can see on the bottom right graph there, only a small sliver is currently allocated. However, other watersheds in Alberta, such as the South Saskatchewan River watershed, are already nearing or are at their allocation limits. Given the current projections for Alberta's climate in the future, I personally believe it'd be incredibly prudent to allocate and use the water we currently have incredibly wisely, acknowledging that water could become more scarce in the future years. So this is just some quick overview maps. So the outline here that's kind of popping out is the North Saskatchewan River. All the black lines in between are all the sub-watersheds, so the smaller one step below that. And this just shows, again, that kind of precipitation gradient where you can see, again, in the southwest, where the headwaters are, that's where the bulk of the precipitation occurs. And then the water flows through across the landscape, kind of in a southwest to east direction across the province. But you'll also notice that's where the majority of our forest cover is. So this is a forest cover map, and you'll notice as you go from southwest to east across the watershed, you get decreasing amounts of forest vegetation. And again, the role of plant life and intact forest has a significant role on the local hydrological cycle and how water recycles locally. So this gets us to land use and the impacts on water. So there's a ton of things that can have some impact on water, whether that's reducing its quality, whether it's decreasing its abundance. There's lots of things that can happen that human activities can influence. Everything from agricultural runoff to grazing, to industrial forestry, to oil and gas extraction, to gravel extraction. There's a ton. But I'm going to focus here on just a few. So for example, with forestry, when you remove, again, if you remove a little bit of forest, it's not the end of the world. But when you start piling up these disturbances, it really starts to lead to a lot of erosion and a lot of cumulative impacts related to that. Even if you're dealing with the erosion on a site-by-site basis, you might be missing the larger picture of a little bit of erosion from your site, a little bit from the one next door, a little bit of erosion from the road. And altogether that ends up being detrimental to the aquatic health of nearby water systems. As you can see, you get rilling, especially on old logging roads that might be deactivated. You can have impacts from recreation. You can have misuse of wetland areas that can lead to fairly long-lasting damage and impacts on the hydrology. Things like issues around with cattle ranching and with agricultural runoff. And again, with all of these things, great leaps and bounds have been taken by the government, by civil society to try to address these issues. But the problem is we're not perfect. And this is a very big province, and enforcement can't be everywhere at once. So a lot of these problems kind of accumulate and do start to have detrimental impacts. And one that's been in the news a whole lot lately is coal mining. So I'll very briefly talk about just the risks associated and threats around climate change and the North Saskatchewan watershed. So the source of the North Saskatchewan starts and begins at the Saskatchewan Glacier within the Columbian ice fields. That's where that circle is. This is a zoomed in photo of the, I think it's called the, I'm not a glaciologist, the tail of the glacier. This is what satellite imagery had from Google in 1984. And this is the same photo in 2016. You'll notice it's retreated about 700 meters. And that was reasonably consistent throughout each annual time lapse, showing the gradual retreat of those glaciers. And this process is only expected to accelerate. What we're expected to get are warmer and wetter winters, warmer and drier summers, which means we'll actually get more precipitation annually, but we'll get less when we need it in the summer. More of it's going to fall in the winter. More of that precipitation is going to fall as rain. We will have less snow as the temperatures warm up. And because of that, rain and water moves across the landscape much more quickly than snow. Snow melts over time as the spring and summer go through and gives us kind of a little consistent amount of water flowing across the land base. If we start getting a ton of it in the spring and we don't get the snowpacks, that raises concerns about, well, how much water is left in these creeks and rivers come August and September. We're expected to see continued retreat of the glaciers and changing vegetation, mainly around the tree line increasing, getting higher up on mountaintops. And it's likely to push out some species that don't have corridors sufficient enough to move to better habitat or more suitable habitat. So the Bighorn backcountry, the capital region's drinking water supply. So the Bighorn is basically considered the headwaters region of the North Saskatchewan and supplies about 88% of the water in the entire system. The majority of this is not from glaciers, but from streams, tributaries, and precipitation. And highlighting again that it is important to maintain forest cover in these headwaters regions for all the reasons that I've been stating and listed there. So this is the time lapse. Anybody can pull this up on Google Earth Engine online. It's free to view. Oh, if I can get it to work. There we go. So this shows each frame is 1 year of satellite photos, and you can see the increasing disturbance. Most of this is from forestry cut blocks, but how it really just builds up over time. And again, while each one of these might not be a problem in and of itself, when you zoom out and start looking at the full land base, you can see how all those brown patches are essentially bare land. There might be regrowing vegetation on it, but it's not fulfilling the same role in terms of evapotranspiration, nor for water moving across the land base. And this is just one disturbance. I mean, there's other at a more finer scales that are hard to capture from this zoomed out view, but this just shows the breadth of how these cumulative impacts really creep up year over year. So this was it in 1984, and that was it in the 2016 reference year, the red outline being the Bighorn backcountry public land use zones that are currently out there. Oh yes, so I'm gonna finally end up, I know I'm running out of time here, or I'm out of time. This is a quick 2-minute video, just quickly highlighting the concerns in this region in terms of watershed management and specifically for the impacts of coal mining. Did I hit the right share button? Is it playing sound?
West Country. Rivers. Streams. Forests. Home. To people. To wildlife. The source of water for millions. From Rocky Mountain House to Edmonton and across the country, the water that starts here flows thousands of kilometers, sustaining life along the way.
So, you know, all this was taken from a helicopter.
This landscape is
around
already under immense
Bighorn.
pressure from forest harvest, oil and gas, and recreation. It can't sustain anymore. And yet tens of thousands of hectares were leased to coal companies in 2020. The West Country now contains nearly 150,000 hectares of leases, and 2 mining companies continue to progress towards open-pit mines in these areas. Ram River Coal has already conducted exploration for its Aries mine, which at its closest point would be 800 meters from the Ram River. The mountain landscape here will become a 6,000-acre open pit. Valerie Resources is forging ahead with the Blackstone mine in sensitive ecological areas near the Clearwater River. Coal exploration and development is destructive to fish and wildlife habitat, pollutes our water, and pushes out tourism and recreation. Coal has no place on this landscape. The government of Alberta is currently deciding on a new policy for coal development in the region. Your voice is important for the future of the West Country. Take action today and say no to coal.
Yeah, so that's a video we put together back in the summer of 2021. Note that a few things have changed regarding coal mining in Alberta. I'll get to that on my last slide there. I don't think I have enough time, so I will kind of just skip these slides. But essentially, recent developments on the Alberta coal policy. Essentially, the government finally released their recommendation reports publicly on March 8th. The key recommendations of the committee was that coal development would not be permitted until a new policy was replaced with legally binding regional or sub-regional plans, and that all essentially all new coal exploration or development along the eastern slopes would be suspended. However, there are still 4 mines going forward. So while some of the concern around coal mining in the Rockies and the threat it has to water security in the North Saskatchewan have been mitigated by this announcement, there are still ongoing and existing concerns related to this industrial disturbance related to water quality, and stay tuned for more. This is my last slide. Just on how you as an individual can get involved. So the coal policy committee, the government formed this coal policy committee because there was an outcry by the public. And the only reason that they walked back on this, I'm 100% sure, is because there was such public opposition to the idea. No matter how new you are to an issue or how long you've been on it, it could be the first time you've heard of it, or it could be something you've worked on for 40 years. You can always make a difference. It could be as simple as throwing your name on a petition. And this is kind of in increasing levels of engagement and efforts, writing a letter, making a call, or talking to your local representative. If you don't know enough about the issue yourself, there's probably an organization out there that is working on the issue. For environmental issues, there's groups like CPAWS or the Council of Canadians. There's other groups for other issues, but there's always someone you can reach out to, or some way you can make your voice heard. So with that, thank you very much. And I think I can probably just answer any questions anybody has in the chat, so we can move with the next presentation. Would that work?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I guess that's the way we'll have to do it for now, Chris, but that was a fantastic presentation. Partly for my own fault, we're about 10 minutes behind here, and we do want to give the other speakers enough time. And so if you could do it on the chat, there will be some time afterwards as well. There are, I think, 4 questions there, but hopefully those people answering the question will be patient and stay with us. And I assume that, Christina, you'll hang on to those questions and also the stories. So thank you very much, Chris. And boy, I don't know, in some ways I can hardly wait to get back out to the West Country. In some ways, some of those photographs are disturbing. So thanks very much. We'll move on to now our second speakers, which will be Ian Skinner and Mike Northcott. So if you guys could come online right now. If you try to keep it to 15 minutes if you can, but we'll just do the best you can. Okay, I'm going to sign out. Leave it to you guys.
They can hear us now.
I believe so. Can you hear us?
Yeah,
Loud and
we
clear.
Yeah, I'm just trying to share the screen here.
all good, Ian.
Yeah, your screen is up and good to go, Ian. So if you just
You
want to
can see it?
yeah, if you just want to hit the slideshow button.
Oh, perfect. Here, we'll go to the slideshow.
Just a little bit more.
Okay.
Oh, a little bit more back. Yeah. Or let's move your chair around.
Okay, can you see it?
Yeah, you're good to go.
Oh, perfect. Okay, good evening. My name is Ian Skinner. I'm joined here with Mike Northcott. We're with the Onoway River Valley Conservation Association, and we're going to discuss aggregate strip mining and its effect on water bodies within the Sturgeon River watershed. So our first slide shows a number of different water bodies, and similar pictures can be found in Canada's groundwater resources, and it's written by a chief hydrogeologist of the Geological Survey of Canada, and his name is Alfonso Ribeira.
Let's just go here.
Okay, you got it there, yeah. And just to define a water body, this is the Alberta Public Lands Act and also the Alberta Water Act. A water body or public water body, like public land, is the bed and shore of all permanent and naturally occurring bodies of water and all naturally occurring rivers, streams, watercourses, and lakes. This means any location where the water flows or is present, whether or not the flow or the presence of water is continuous, intermittent, or occurs only during a flood, so floodplains, and includes but not limited to wetlands and aquifers. So includes but not limited to means these very important things: wetlands and aquifers. So you'll see a number of different water bodies. You'll see lakes, springs, recharge areas, aquifers, bottom of the groundwater basin, the ocean, to name a few. We'll move on to our next slide. And we've had 3 questions posed. And the first one is, why is sustainable supply of fresh water so important to all Albertans? So now we understand what a water body is. Aquifers are sorts of naturally filtered potable water for thousands of rural residents. Given the ubiquity of groundwater and surface water exchange, the fact of appearing everywhere or being very common, it is more appropriate to view groundwater and surface water as a single source. The continuous exchange of water between the subsurface and the surface acts to sustain base flows and maintain water levels in water bodies. So now you can view it as a single source. It is so naturally produced fresh water is an essential element to naturally human health, common good, and the importance of natural capital. So natural capital can be defined as the province is stocked of natural assets, which include geology, soil, air, water, and all living things. And it's from this natural capital that humans have derived a wide range of services, often called ecosystem services, which make human life possible, and most important, the food we eat and the water we drink. So what are the threats to a sustainable supply of fresh water in Alberta? Ignoring and or not implementing the very laws required to ensure that we have sustainable and healthy natural amounts and functioning of publicly owned water bodies. So Section 60 of the Municipal Government Act says, subject to any other enactment, a municipality has the direction, control, and management of all the water bodies within the municipality, including the airspace above and the ground below. Also, how can concerned citizens best respond to the water issues brought forward today? Pay attention in an enforceable manner by legal means to those laws being ignored, combined with identifying those individuals responsible for ignoring and or implementing those laws specifically designed to protect Alberta's public water bodies.
Not implementing, I think you missed the not word, but not implementing.
Yeah, not implementing those laws specifically designed to protect those water bodies. So the rule of law is undermined when government officials and or agencies can no longer comprehend and or actively choose to ignore their own regulations and legislation, failing to apply them at the appropriate circumstances at the earliest stage of land use planning and development. Average citizens cannot be expected to be aware when the governing body ignores the law. So here is a picture of a strip mine, an aggregate strip mine. They're mining an aquifer, and you can see the layers of geology prior to strip mining. On your top left corner, you'll see the black sands, and that's where they mine gold, silver, platinum, etc.
You have to understand at this particular time, when you see this, this is the water that's left in this area that was probably an aquifer. So you see that all that water is pumped out into a holding pond and kept there while the mining is continued down at these lowest levels.
So this next picture is the same, I guess, quarter section. You can see the topography on the landscape above. It's fairly flat, and that's what they're reclaiming. They're reclaiming that particular pit, and you can see those layers of geology are gone. That aquifer is now destroyed. Here's a spot near Villeneuve where there was an asphalt plant set, and you can see the contamination from petroleum products. It looks like it's been there for quite some time. And here's an area that was fairly close to that asphalt plant where they're just backfilling that material into a hole that's next to where they were.
And you can see residue water in there too, which is surface water, which has no options but to percolate down or be discharged into a naturally flowing water body.
This slide here was an illegal water diversion that was located on a tributary or sub-watershed of the Sturgeon River, and it was Cleany Creek. And this is, how large were those hoses?
I think they were probably 8-inch. They're flexible hoses, or sort of like a fire hose, but I think they were between 6 or 8 inches.
And that was water that was going to be used in a wash plant. And that was that's an aquifer area here that comes very close to the surface that was opened during previous mining, correct?
Right, and you see off to the center part of the picture, you see those piles. When those are ex-gravel pits that were done in the 1940s. At that particular time, they were doing what they call wet mining, which means they were taking a clamshell and digging the gravel down in under the water level, which you can see behind that pumping system, and using the clamshell to pull the gravel up and pile it along that berm that you see there, because that is gravel that hasn't been taken out. And the reason that they want to keep that area active is so they can access the water.
Okay, this slide here, you can see an area between two quarter sections that was mined out, and it was mined without approval, and they explained to us that it was a miscommunication and or a misunderstanding, that it was removed and there were no consequences applied by either the municipality or the provincial government. So we're back to the slide of water bodies. So municipal governments have the direction, control, and management of all water bodies, the airspace above and the ground below, and they have since 1968 in this province. Somehow there's legislation for water quality and water quantity that is being ignored. For example, the Public Lands Act, Section 54, prohibitions. I challenge everybody to go have a look at that and to see what it says.
Can you give me the most?
Sure can. So it says, no person shall cause, permit, or suffer the existence on any public land of any excavation of any kind that is undesirable, the doing of any act on public land that may injuriously affect watershed capacity, and the disturbance of any public land in any manner that may result or is likely to result in injury to the bed or shore of any river, stream, watercourse, lake, or other body of water, or land in the vicinity of that public land. So it clearly describes that no person shall harm a water body, no person shall cause, permit, or suffer.
Now, in order to really identify the water body, this is public property. This is a river. And for 100 feet on the other side of the highest level that the river reaches is public land and public property. So all of that area plus this one here is also public property. This one here down here is also public property. And all of this in this area here is public property too. Anywhere the water flows or is present. Now this also includes this water down here that's underground, because it says, this includes, it says in that section 60 that it includes, when identifying water body, that it includes the aquifers underneath the ground. That is also public property. So disturbing that is actually has a series of rules that Ian just read out, and are very important to follow, because you don't want to destroy this to be able to do its natural thing and produce all of this infrastructure required to maintain its health. So you can understand our concern when we find out that this mining that Ian just showed you that went down into this area here, especially the ones closer to the surface, which probably has a high grade aggregate to be extracted and washed and cleaned and used to produce this city and or this city here. So you can see how that affects the system. So in Europe, they found out that if they went and they quarried here, they could build houses in a proper way in Europe, because if you look at the houses in Europe, they're all stone. So a stone house doesn't burn. So as far as our cities are concerned, the way we build them, we're getting into trouble by building something that burns rather than building something that doesn't. Thank you.
So just in closing, there was an organization back in the 70s, and it was called the Environmental Conservation Authority, and they described the fairly obvious significant negative impacts of strip mining, where the most frequently expressed concerns centered around water quality and quantity. Concerns also related to reducing waterway flow rates, disrupting groundwater flow patterns, and endangering wildlife habitat, lowering aesthetics values were also reported. So it was, what we believe is what we're seeing is regulatory capture. Our regulatory agencies are captured. Also with red tape reduction, we hear this red tape reduction, let's reduce the legislation. If you want to appeal a land bylaw decision at the municipal level, you can, but they'll never include section 60. So in that case, you can never, ever, ever appeal a decision with the other enactments. They say, okay, the province looks after the water. By the time it reaches the provincial level, the only thing you can appeal at that particular time is a Water Act approval or a Water Act decision or an Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act decision. So in that particular case, you'll go to the Environmental Appeal Board. They will not hear any other legislation other than the Water Act or the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act. So what we're seeing is section 60 has not been included in the decision-making at the land use planning and development stage, at the early stage of land use planning and development. Did you have anything else to add to that, Mike?
Well, it seems obvious that when you go to the appeal board, and we've been there, so we know what happens, there's a situation that if you identify their success rate, they uphold the decisions of their people 99 point some percentage of the time. So your appeal is not going to be probably paid or successful for that particular reason.
So again, it's strip mining aquifers, strip mining water bodies, and aggregate strip mining is the second largest strip mining activity in Alberta. The oil sands being number 1 and coal strip mining being number 3. And that's the end of our presentation. If you have any questions, we'd certainly enjoy answering them if we can. And I'll turn it back to Richard, I guess, or Christina.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ian and Mike. And I just love that country up there that you're talking about all along the Sturgeon. And it's disturbing, some of the photos and information you present. So I'm hoping to talk with you more about that. In any case, it is 8 o'clock now. We're about 15 minutes behind, and we maybe try to pack too much into this, but we do want to hear from the other speakers, of course. And the Q&A, I don't see too many loaded there right now, but we may have to leave those until the end. I know for those of you out there in cyberspace, it's a lot of information, but hopefully you will use some of it. So I'm going to just move directly into Paul Belanger. So Paul is shown himself now. He's still muted, but Paul, you're good to go, and it is now 8:01. If you can try to keep it 15 minutes, that'd be great. Paul's going to talk about the Athabasca River.
All right, if the first slide could go on. Welcome everyone, and thanks for being here. Thanks for being interested. And I'll quickly go through what I've prepared here. And looks like the, okay, here we go. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so here's just a quick shot of the Athabasca River watershed, and in blue and also in gray. So you can see a good part of the watershed is in northern Saskatchewan, draining straight into Lake Athabasca. And incidentally, the river does start in the mountains, as noted earlier by our CPAWS colleague. And the start of the Athabasca River is probably 15 miles from where the North Saskatchewan River starts. Next slide, please. So this shows the watershed in our whole area that ends up in the Slave River. So this is the acreage that is the Slave River drains. Very extensive. So this includes, of course, the Peace River watershed. Next slide, please. So overall, the Athabasca River is the longest river in the province. So here's some quick information, quick details. Next slide, please. One unique feature of the river is as the Athabasca River gets close to Lake Athabasca, what we have there is a very large delta. It's the largest freshwater delta in the world. It's fed by the Peace River and also the Athabasca River. Athabasca being the main supply of this delta. So the quality of this delta is largely determined by the quality of the water in the Athabasca River. You can see if you look closely, that the Peace River winds north of Lake Claire, or just on the north end of the delta, and then flows directly into the Slave River. But some of that water does discharge into this, flow through this delta. Next slide, please. So in terms of historical significance, this was the first access route by early trappers and colonial people. And it was very relatively easy to travel on with different size watercraft. And you can see the long and winding Mackenzie River flowing to the Arctic, which was explored early on. Next slide, please. So here's a painting, 1871, of a typical voyageur camp, Métis voyageur camp, along one of our many rivers in the west. This is probably a romantic version of the Athabasca River. Next slide, please. So of the treaties, the Athabasca River divides this Treaty 6 and Treaty 8. So the river is the border of two treaties up to a point, up to an area just past of Athabasca, and then Treaty 6, the river then flows into Treaty 6. Next slide, please. So here, what I'm showing is some of the key point source pollution issues that we've been dealing with for a long time. The point sources being pulp mills and large water treatment plants. So we have the earliest pulp mill, the Hinton Mill, which was put in place there in somewhere around 1958. And it was very damaging and toxic until the early 90s, until they switched to a hybrid bleaching system that removed the reduced chlorine. We also have two pulp mills now in Whitecourt. Those were built there roughly in the 80s. And then there's a pulp mill in Slave Lake, which drains into the Slave River, with Lesser Slave River, which then drains in the Athabasca. Then we have this large pulp mill north of the town of Athabasca, Alpac, built there in the 90s. The other point source emissions being the big water treatment plants. First one is in Jasper, another one in Hinton, another one in Whitecourt, then the town of Athabasca, and then a large one, the very large water treatment plant in Fort McMurray. The final point source emissions are the impacts of the direct impacts of the heavy oil mining, oil sands, and that's, I'm sure you've seen plenty of pictures of the impacts there. We're not getting into that too much tonight. Next slide, please. So one interesting feature of this river, which is very important, underrated, is the Grand Rapids, which is an area of the Athabasca River before Fort McMurray that drops 100 feet in just a few kilometers. And so of course you can imagine there's many waterfalls, there's very dangerous rapids. This killed many traveler in the so-called early colonial days. It's important to note that the oxygen level in the river drops to quite a low level past the Athabasca River, considering all the impacts, down to just a couple, 2 or 3 or 4 parts per million. The rapids add a tremendous amount of oxygen to the river, allowing the river to recover and to support fish. If it wasn't for those rapids, the service of oxygenation created by those rapids, we'd have a far more dire situation going into where the river goes into the Fort McMurray area. Next slide, please. So one of the things we're looking at as a group, Keepers of the Water, is considering a new legal method to further protect our rivers. It's called creating legal personhood. So here we're showing a slide of the Magpie River in Quebec, in eastern Quebec. It's a 300-kilometer river, and last February it became the first river in Canada to achieve legal personhood. And so that's quite an exciting development. Now, this has been an international movement, the whole concept of creating rights for nature, personhood for rivers. So we've got about a dozen rivers around the world now that have achieved legal rights. And we're looking to do the same with the Athabasca River in one of our near future projects or developments. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons why this particular river, this is a nice photo from the Narwhal recently, their story about personhood of this river is that it's very popular for whitewater rafters. It's in the top 10 in the world, and it goes through a pristine area, and it's also protected and a historical indigenous land by a indigenous group called the Innu, which is a type of Cree culture. Their language is similar to Cree, and they played a large role in creating personhood for this river and are on the guardian group that speaks for the river. Next slide, please. So yeah, thanks for participating, and so I believe the future protection will come through personhood and creating legal rights for nature. We heard earlier about some of the convoluted regulations and the difficulties of dealing with government and industry in terms of getting any progress. We've had trouble for 40 years, so we're looking to do something more hopeful than wrangling with local authorities and regulatory bodies that really have not done much for protection. We're still on the downslide, so we're hopeful that legal rights will be the way to go. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. And as I was saying to Paul before he did the presentation, just the photos alone are enough to stimulate me to perhaps get more involved with the Athabasca River, and even though it's a little distant from here, but you know, very nice presentation, Paul. Thanks so much. And you know, hopefully again, the people out there in cyberspace will have patience with the imperfections of our presentation here in terms of time, but we have to move right on, and then we'll get into some Q&A. And I guess, Peter, you're going to be a little behind, but our next speaker will be Jacqueline Noga, and Jacqueline's with the U of A, and perhaps she can give us the specifics on her role there, and she's going to talk to us about wastewater to some extent and human health. So go ahead, Jacqueline.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for having me. I'll just share my screen right away and then introduce myself a little bit more. So it was actually my former role at the University of Alberta, was in the Water and Resource Recovery Lab in the School of Public Health. And in that role, we were looking at opportunities for water reuse and resource recovery. I'll touch on what that means and what it could look like a little bit more later on in this presentation, but I thought I would start by giving my own treaty and land acknowledgement. So I live and work in Misquachi, Waskagan. which is on Treaty 6 territory. That's also the homeland of the Métis and of the Papas Chase First Nation. And I like to start my presentations by just sharing the immense gratitude that I have towards the treaty land and water and the first people who continue to work to protect it. Indigenous people are the original keepers of the water, and I think it's important to keep that in mind as we learn from each other today, that there's lots of knowledge out there that we can take into account. So this first image is in the river valley in Edmonton. I'm taking my cat for a little walk. It's right by the E.L. Smith water treatment plant, and a lot of this land has now been turned into a solar farm. If I have time, I'll get into that near the end of my presentation, but just to kind of, this ties in really well and brings it back to what Chris was saying about how land and water are deeply connected. And it's just very important to keep that in mind when we think about the river valley and the water and the river itself. It's all related. So I will want to start by just showing kind of the classic water cycle that likely many of us learned when we were growing up. With the kind of typical water goes up into the air, then it's held in clouds, then it precipitates down and goes back into our groundwater or our surface water. And what I want to do is talk a little bit, this actually ties in really well with everything our other speakers have said in terms of what that cycle looks like in our context. So I'm speaking specifically for the Edmonton context, and I would encourage you, if you're joining us from elsewhere, to kind of explore what your own water source is. Just quickly, because Chris touched on this as well, thank goodness, our water source originates in the Saskatchewan Glacier, which is in the Columbia ice fields, and their headwaters are at the Bighorn, as mentioned. And also, as mentioned, the Bighorn area is was being discussed and is still kind of under risk of coal mining threats. And so that means that when you are talking about and you see the lawn signs that say protect our headwaters, what that means is when we see coal development happening in the headwaters, that is coming downstream towards us. So from the headwaters of the North Saskatchewan, the river flows and eventually it reaches the city of Edmonton. And it's at the city of Edmonton where EPCOR pulls the water out of the river at either the E.L. Smith water treatment plant or the Rossdale water treatment plant. And then, I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to EPCOR for providing us with safe, clean drinking water every day. All we have to do is turn on our taps and there it is. But it took quite a journey to get there. And, with increasing threats to our water, EPCOR is doing a really good job of making sure that we still have safe water here. And it's days like the spring runoff days when our water smells extra chlorine-y that we're reminded that, someone is doing some stuff to our water. So once the water has been treated at the treatment plant and comes through the taps, then we're using it for things like drinking, flushing, washing. And then from there, the water will go back either through pipes to the Gold Bar wastewater treatment plant and back into the river, or the water might go down into the ground, or it might end up kind of running through the sewers. And it makes its way back into the river, and then it heads downstream to the next recipient. And I won't make anyone actually say it, but maybe I'll just do a quick quiz for you to think of on your own. Does anyone know which municipality downstream is the next to use the river from the water? So it's the fine folks in Lloydminster that are drinking the water that came from our wastewater treatment plant. And if that seems kind of gross or scary, that's not scary because we are drinking Devon's wastewater, if you want to see it that way. And I don't say that to kind of seem like our water is dirty, but just to kind of emphasize that the water that we have now is the same water that our ancestors were drinking, and it's the same water that all the future generations will be using. So water is not going anywhere. We have the same amount of water that we did, and we always will. And I guess to my knowledge, the only example of a time when water is permanently removed from our water cycle is in hydraulic fracturing. So in oil and gas development, when some water is piped down into the rock some water, a lot of water is pumped down into the rock to release fossil fuels. That water typically stays down there. And like I mentioned, to my knowledge, that's the only time that we see water truly removed from the water cycle. This year's UN's World Water Day theme is groundwater. So that's kind of, I just wanted to touch on that quickly to say that it's not just the water that we see flowing in the rivers, but there's also a wealth of aquifers and water underneath the ground that is a larger part of this cycle. So with that in mind, I'll just take a pause, and I want everyone to think about, with all of this in mind and with all of those other wonderful presentations that talked about kind of what's happening with our water sources, consider, is this the best way that we could be using our water? So all of the water on Earth right now is cycling through rivers, through pipes, through our own bodies. And are we using it in a way that shows respect for this cycle and also shows gratitude as the ultimate giver of life? So for the next part of my presentation, I'm going to jump into one opportunity, one area that we could kind of recreate the way that we use our water. So some of you may already be doing this, but one way to use water in, I would argue, a more efficient way is using irrigation water that's captured from rain. So when you're capturing rainwater either on your roof or however you do it, what you're doing is you're capturing a viable source of water, and you're using it for a safe purpose. And in the water reuse world, we call that fit for purpose. So then consider, when you're flushing your toilet with drinking water, does that seem like a fit for purpose use of that water? Or could we be doing things differently? So for example, we could be taking our shower water and having pipes laid that into the toilet and have that flushed. And that, that obviously requires infrastructure and actions from not necessarily the homeowner themselves, but from a developer or a builder. But what I learned through some of the research that we did, we had focus groups with people who were just citizens. The goal of the focus groups was to just talk to people who live in the area, and during those conversations, I found out that there's people who actually plug their tubs before they shower, and they keep a scoop beside their tub, and throughout the day they'll use that shower water to flush their toilets. And I realized that for some people that seems totally silly and perhaps out of the question, but it doesn't have to be quite so individual intensive. You can have infrastructure in place to make it easier. For example, there's toilets in Europe where the sink basin where you wash your hands is connected directly to the toilet, so that all of that wash water goes into your toilet basin to flush. Another example that maybe some folks on the call are familiar with, we used to have washing machines that would capture the water in a separate basin, and then they would reuse it. So you could wash your whites, that water would then be used again to wash your darks. But just to say that there's a lot of opportunities out there to be reusing it, and it's more of, I'll touch on this a little bit more in a bit, it's more of just kind of getting the will to want to do that. My final kind of hypothetical example before I jump into some real world examples would be our toilet water. So of course, for many people, the idea of reusing toilet water for almost anything is unacceptable. And it's important to respect boundaries, but the reality is our bodies are so interesting that even our excretions have resources in them. So we excrete phosphorus and nitrogen. And a fun fact that I like to share is right now, the primary source of phosphorus that we have for fertilizer is from a mine in Morocco. But we could be harvesting phosphorus from our own waste and then using it to create our own fertilizer as a local source. So this is an image of a water recycling plant in Windhoek, Namibia. And that is Namibia is a country in the southwest corner of Africa. And the folks in Windhoek have been drinking recycled water for 53 years. So what happens with this plant is they take the wastewater, they treat it through an intensive process, and then they augment the current water source. So it's about 25% of the drinking water is from the recycled water plant. I had the incredible privilege of going to this plant, and I got to drink from a water fountain at it, and it was great, and I didn't get sick. And I think, you know, it's more of a mental barrier than it is a technological barrier. A more local example is at the Vancouver Convention Center, where they collect water from the toilets and from the sinks. And in the wintertime, they'll use that water, they'll have it you know, treated to a certain standard, and then have it recycled back into the toilets for flushing. And in the summer, they use it to irrigate the living roof. And this roof, according to their website, has 400,000 indigenous plant species in it. And as you can see from this picture, it's looking pretty green. It looks good. So the water is obviously doing its job. My final example is from the, so it was, I believe it was in 2020 that the very first water reuse project for drinking water was approved in Alberta. And a really great group of people, so the Advancing Canadian Wastewater Assets, the University of Calgary, Village Brewery, and Xylem is a water treatment company, worked together to produce beer from recycled water. And yeah, I definitely drank the glass of beer that you're looking at, and it was also delicious. And so again, it's just to say that it's possible. So next I want to talk about, so what does it take for us to get there? So there is some good news. We did have Alberta Health Services and Alberta Health released guidelines for drinking water. They released guidelines for health metrics for drinking water that's from recycled water. And these regulations, you know, I forget, which speaker mentioned red tape reduction. And you have to balance the idea that red tape reduction means more opportunity with the idea that some regulations actually create opportunity. So if we had more regulations around what the expectations are when it comes to recycled water quality, and what that needs to look like from the kind of health and environmental safety perspective, we can then see, or the people who are interested in pursuing recycled water projects have the opportunity to have guidance and to know what is expected of them so that they can create projects that are safe. And how do we get to that place? How do we get regulations that are well-informed and supportive? Well, it's important to talk to the people on the ground who would be involved in implementing water reuse. So this is an image from a workshop that we hosted at the Western Canada Water Conference. So people came to this conference voluntarily. They signed up for this particular session, so there was some interest in it. The people at this session were wastewater operators, water managers, everyone who works within that field. And we kind of gathered everyone together and asked, what could water reuse look like? And had them just talk about, you know, in their own context, what that could be. And so from there, you know, we learned about how to inform regulation. And you know, I unfortunately don't have time to get too much into it, but you know, our website for that is reusewater.ca if you want to learn more. So I will wrap it up. I don't want to take up too much time. So kind of coming back to, again, Chris's presentation, this is a perfect way to cycle back to it, which is what can you do? So one thought would be you can start in your own backyard or your balcony, depending on where you live, and collect your own rainwater. So this photo is from Tanzania, which is where I used to work, where the primary barrier for rainwater collection was not having the proper storage containers in place. But here in Alberta, in Edmonton, we have great opportunities for rainwater collection systems. There's lots out there, and you know, depending on where you live, sometimes the government subsidizes access to those. So that's just one opportunity, but maybe that's not viable for you, or perhaps you already have a rainwater collection system and you want to do more. As Chris mentioned, you know, you can write to your MLA and express interest and just show your support and learn more. I think there's so many opportunities out there to just keep learning about how we can start working better with and respecting water to the degree that I'm sure everyone on this call appreciates it's important too. So my final slide, I want to leave you with this, which is that we all need water, and that's not going to change. But the way that what we can change is the way we think of water. And just quickly cycling back to how I started this presentation, talking about the land and the water in relationship to each other. I think it's important to not overlook environmental protection generally when we're talking about protecting our water. As Chris said, you need lots of trees and forests in order to make sure that the ecosystem is thriving. So as I mentioned, there is a solar farm that was put up in the River Valley last year. I'm with a group that is currently working to fight against that, because while solar power is great and renewable energy is a fantastic thing, it needs to be done correctly. And putting solar panels in the River Valley in a floodplain was a mistake, and we are actively fighting against that. So if you are interested in learning more about that, I'll put both these links that I've mentioned, or the websites in the chat, but you can go to ervcc.com to learn more about that particular activity. Yeah, with that, I will wrap up, and I'm happy to answer questions, or if we're not doing that, then thank you for your time.
All right, thank you very much, Jacqueline. Very interesting. And now I know that some of my personal wastes will eventually end up, I'll be drinking them myself. I know a lot of places are going that way, including California. In any case, we are about 15 minutes behind here, and I see people tend to, after an hour and a half, tend to leave, but we really would appreciate if those of you that are there could stick around for a little while longer. Now, Peter, I wonder if we could cover the Q&A first and have you come on last. I hope that wouldn't put you off too much.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. And so we have the Q&A now. They sort of disappeared from my screen. So Christina, could we get the Q&A and the chat that's still available, and maybe we'll turn it back to Mackenzie and Carolina to answer, or to choose some of those Q&A for the speakers. Well, we've still got a few people around. I see it dropping off quickly. We've still got 70 people left, but hopefully you can stick around a little while longer. And we would like to tell a few more of your stories, but we're hoping to use your stories in the future somehow to tell the world how much we love our rivers here. So that said, could we get the Q&A from that was already being expressed over the time up for now, Christina?
Yeah, maybe I'll let Mackenzie ask. It looks like we have one unanswered question that is for Jacqueline.
Okay, I'm sorry. So the other questions were answered online already then?
Yep.
Okay, all right, then we'll have some time for maybe more of the stories, which I'd like to get to next there. Go ahead, Mackenzie.
Okay, yeah, I will first ask get this question answered, but I did actually save, there was a lot of questions in the chat and not in the Q&A section, but I did save them. So I'll kind of go back to them too after this. And they're for previous speakers, but I took note of who the questions were for and everything. But yeah, so the question says to Jacqueline, great work. And do you have any thoughts on desalinization? I can't even, you can see it. We had one on our sailboat many years ago.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's one great way to do it. I guess I should have prefaced more clearly. I don't think water reuse is the be-all end-all solution, and I think desal is another great opportunity. It is, as I'm sure you've appreciated, it's quite energy intensive, but it is, it's a possibility. There's lots of options out there, and I think it's best that we not put all of our eggs in one basket. So it's a good one.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. And then again, I'm going to go back. We had a few questions in the chat. I'm guessing all of the speakers are still here. So I guess I'll circle back. There was a few questions for Ian and Mike, if you guys wanted to come on, and I can kind of address those to you guys. So the first one here was, so if the groundwater is contaminated extensively, how far underground will the contamination spread?
What was the question again?
Yeah, here, I'll repeat it. Yeah, sorry about that. So the groundwater is contaminated extensively. How far underground will the contamination spread?
Okay, you can
You
hear
guys
me
want to
now?
put your, if you want to put your video on, that'd be great. Ian and Mike.
Okay, you can hear me though. No, it doesn't matter. We can do it without the.
There you go. It's on.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, you said how far will the contamination go? What happens is, and it's been discovered that when they planted fuel tanks in service stations underground and those tanks leaked, that they would create a plume downstairs, downstream in the aquifer that could carry on for miles. And there's very difficult to stop that. And it's a very extensive drilling of wells and forcing other things down into the wells to stop that plume. And quite often it doesn't happen. So if there's any change in the watershed, as far as quality is concerned, it can go on probably for as far as the source goes downstream. Does that answer your question?
I believe it was covered. Yes, thank you so much for that. And we actually did have another question for you guys. It said that they were just wondering what the solutions that we should be trying or suggesting, or any organizations we should be supporting when making a difference in these areas that you guys covered.
The legislation.
Yes, it was just identifying the legislation in a clear and orderly manner and officially taking it in front of a judicial review and being able to identify why these particular rules and regulations are not being followed at the very earliest stages when planning is being anticipated in regards to these activities that go down into these alluvial aquifers. And I think that it's pretty obvious that the legislation is being ignored and or even purposely not looked after. And I think that that has to be brought to a position where it can be judicially decided as to why.
Okay, well, thank you for that. There was another question farther back in the chat, and it's actually for Paul. So if we could get him on just so he could answer it. It kind of starts, this one's a little bit more general, but they were just kind of wondering if you could just expand a little on the role of the keepers and kind of, yeah, just dive into that and give it a little bit more of an explanation.
Okay, I'll keep my video off because of my poor connection. The Keepers of the Athabasca is an Indigenous and citizen and science-based group. We are an activist group, but we're also a community monitoring group. We like to call ourselves a group that follows science and also traditional ecological knowledge. So right now, our primary focus is is creating a better, particularly the Indigenous people, and also we're also focused on the tailings pond issue and wanting to see maybe we can. So we're involved with the regulators and meetings and using a variety of different strategies to answer most of the questions people might have.
And then there was actually one final one for you, just higher up in the chat. And I do see that we do have a few messages below, and we'll get to them right after this last one. But yeah, Paul, somebody asked, how can we support personhood for the Athabasca? Sorry.
Yeah, I think the first step is to be in touch, because we're also talking to legal people in Eastern Canada. So if in one of my chat notes, I sent my keeper's email address. So you just send me how you might be able to help or keep you informed as to what you might want to do with the river you're living on, because this is, we're hoping that this sort of process happens for thousands of rivers. So
okay, well,
any other questions at the moment?
I don't think not anymore yet, but we'll definitely let you know if there is some more. So thank you for that. And now I'll pass it maybe to Lena. I do notice there was another question actually for Jacqueline by Caroline. So if Lena, you want to read that off, if you can see it.
Yeah, I saw the question. I believe Jacqueline might have just answered it.
Yeah, sorry, I just answered it in the chat. Unfortunately, it's one of those annoying answers where it depends what it is. You know, scum could be from, it could be from just the natural biofilm that's building up. It could be from chemicals. Yeah, unfortunately, it kind of depends on a lot of different things.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. But I can definitely touch on some more of the stories that people shared on the chat, unless we wanted Peter to say his piece now. Richard, thoughts?
Yeah, I think again, we tried to pack a lot in here, and thank you again, those people who have joined in. And Peter wanted to say a few words. I was suggesting to Peter that you could load what you have written onto the website. So maybe that might be the first thing you want to mention, the Edmonton website, and just give a very brief overview. And I see people are dropping off quickly. So we hope to, a few of you will stay around for some of the stories that are being told here. But maybe we'll let Peter do his piece there. And if you could get the website on there, Peter, and you know, the emails address for those that might want to participate in any of the working groups.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, so let's just get this screen up. If it'll, there we go. So thanks, Richard, and thank you everybody for coming, and thank you for this I'd like to thank the speakers as well for great presentations. Lots of good information. I'm just going to say a little bit about the Council of Canadians. We're the Edmonton chapter of the Council of Canadians, and we're putting this on. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about us. As I said, we're the Edmonton chapter. But the Council of Canadians is a national organization. We got dedicated and talented staff, and including Christina, who's doing such a great job of keeping things organized here, and does a whole bunch of other things. We also have thousands of members across Canada, including many in Alberta, and we have hundreds of volunteers organized into chapters. And of course, we're the Edmonton chapter. We're one of 4 in Alberta and several across the country. We're an independent, the chapters are pretty independent. We decide ourselves what issues and projects we take on. And, but we don't often, most of the time, we don't do things just by ourselves. We collaborate with other council chapters, national organization, and other organizations in our region and across the country. And like CPAWS, for example. there's a list of our activities. We're a pretty eclectic bunch in our chapter, and we've got a lot of different interests. So we decided to kind of organize ourselves in working groups. People who are interested in an issue, they'll be part of a particular working group. So I'm going to flip through them very quickly. Defend Alberta Parks, that was a situation that we were involved in 2020. And you'll see, you've probably seen these Defend Alberta Parks signs. We put on a webinar kind of like this. And what was going on there was that the government was going to decommission a whole bunch of parks. And so many groups across the province, including CPAWS, ourselves, and many others, opposed that. We put on a webinar, and we actually got to meet the Deputy Minister of Environment and put our point of view across. And so we kind of won that battle, or at least stopped the decommissioning for now. They're said that they were in the process of putting new parks legislation in place, so we may have to respond to that in some way. And in each of these slides, I put the link to water. So of course, the parks are really important for us to enjoy the water. And the next big situation we got involved in that has already been mentioned here was the proposed metallurgical coal minings in the eastern slopes, right near our headwaters. And so we joined groups across the province to fight against that. We had a webinar in that for that one as well. And we got involved in the Alberta Beyond Coal sign campaign. And Chris talked about the situation there, so I won't go into any other information about that. It's still, we had some pretty good success, but it's not completely over yet. And of course, the link to water there is the pollutants that come from the coal mines into the rivers. Pesticide-free Edmonton is a working group that we've been involved with, an issue we've been involved with for a long time. And we've been working with others to convince City Council to ban pesticides most harmful to human health and biodiversity. And just yesterday, our folks, along with a bunch of others from Edmonton, came and spoke to City Council, and there may be there are going to be discussions coming up on a pesticide ban. So this is a very active. And of course, pesticides eventually end up in our rivers. And we've heard lots about the Onoway Valley Conservation Association, Ian and Mike, and the Sturgeon River, so I won't go into any detail there. This watershed deserves better protection, and I think that they're going to continue working on that issue. Peace in the military. We advocate for removal of the exemption of the Canadian Armed Forces from Government of Canada emission reduction targets. The military is a big polluter, and they're exempt. We also oppose the purchase of F-35 fighter jets and advocate withdrawal from NATO. In terms of the fighter jets, big cost that could be money that could be used better elsewhere. Digital Public Library. We've been hearing a lot about things like misinformation, that sort of thing. And a lot of that is driven by the fact that our media are profit driven. And so the Digital Public Library Working Group proposes a publicly owned media in which there's democratic access and fair remuneration for content creators. And you can find out more about that with this website. And a digital public library will help us spread our message about the importance of water. The Commons Edmonton podcast. One of our members, former chair Rod, hosts a podcast focused on civil society and democracy. So if you're interested in broadcasting, connect with us on that. And you can listen to Rod's interview with Mike and Ian about the Sturgeon River in a recent episode. Just transition. This is one that we have really not put together yet, but I'm very interested on this issue. We advocate moving to a greener economy in response to the climate crisis. And I think we need a more diversified economy in Alberta. And there's lots of other people who feel that way. There's real, now what's happened? There's real energy around this. And part of the just transition idea, sorry, I've just lost my screen. Part of the just transition idea is that as we move to a more green economy, some people are going to be disadvantaged because of the jobs that they already have. They have jobs in, say, the oil and gas industry. So we need to make sure that they're taken care of as well. And finally, we have a bunch of links. So I will stop the share. I have pasted them into the chat. And that includes the Edmonton Council email address, our website, and a bunch of other sites like our Instagram site, which is the best right now because the students that have been helping us, like Carolina and Mackenzie, have posted some great stuff on Instagram. So send us an email, and we hope to hear more from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. Definitely a great overview of what we're trying to do here. And, in our organization, you can do what you want. You don't have to be involved in something you don't want to be. So if you are interested, please get in touch with us. Again, a long evening, and we still have 49 people now. So I'm happy to go to 9 o'clock. With a few more of the stories and any more questions. If any of the speakers are around, it'd be nice to see you guys, and we could kind of do a grand goodbye here, and everybody can see you. And I don't know if that'll work for you, up to you. And I'll maybe turn it back over to Carolina and Mackenzie to read a few more of the stories, and that's what it boils down to in the end for me, is what is your personal feeling about our rivers, about our water? That's what's going to determine what you do in the future. So thank you again. I'm not going to be appearing again, perhaps too often. It was a long time getting this together, so I hope you can do something with it. An amazing overview of a large amount of water. So thank you all for coming out, and hopefully you can stay till the end here, and we'll read a few more of the stories and say goodbye to you. So go ahead, Mackenzie and Carolina, can you find some more of those stories on the chat?
Of course. So I'm just trying to find some of the places that we were at. Okay. So I know, where is it? So one person had said that when they were growing up, all they thought about water was that it was only used for water skiing and swimming, but it's actually really more than that. Water is the basis of life, and I think it should be recognized in Canadian policy as well as reflected in our actions. It's interesting how our water is so diverse and so important in our world. Yeah, that's a great point, and I think it is really important to either first promote, make sure our government, we're holding them accountable and they are passing policy that protects our water, but also doing it ourselves. And I think it's really great that this person had brought it up because it's really important.
Yeah, and then I also see that Sean, if you're still with us, I saw your story that I was born and raised in Nova Scotia and spent my youth swimming in bays, creeks, and lakes and fishing lobsters with my late father. The salt air is missed at times. And yeah, absolutely. We have fresh water mostly here in Alberta, but it's definitely important to recognize saltwater bodies too.
And then we also have one person, they live in Drumheller, right on the Red Deer River. And the river has always been such a source of serenity and peace for the last 30 years, except for obviously in 2005, when they had to move away temporarily because of the flooding. It is a special place here by the river. Yeah, I think it's great that, you know, even like me being from Red Deer and then them being from Drumheller, it's like we're all connected through the same river and we all kind of have the same sort of values with our river. And yeah.
Yeah, and then Bob and Winnie briefly mentioned kayaking down the Red Deer River, similarly to the points that Mackenzie just made, but also Patricia said camping with my family as a child. My dad woke me early to watch a beaver on the opposite riverbank, successfully gnawing through a tree which fell into the river in front of us. So began my love for Canada's water. And that is such a sweet memory. Go Beavers, I think somebody mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and the next, we also have how somebody had lived on and in the Battle River watershed. They grew up on it and it is in my blood. Now, 60 years later, I see the changes from resource extraction and farming practices that have negatively impacted the quality of water. However, I still kayak when the water level is high and always snowshoe in the winter. There's an eagle's nest and a blue heron rockery that is over 60 years old nearby. It's my favorite place in the world and I've traveled the world. It's home. Yeah, I think it's really important, obviously, it's to acknowledge like all of the terrible things that have been happening to our waters and how it impacts that, but also recognize like the beauty that's still there and make sure we really protect it.
Yeah, and Carrie made a great point that all water is both connected and a connector. And I think that point has really been driven in this conversation. It's a broad common thread that weaves us together. I had the privilege of having access to a family cabin in a tiny lake in BC. My family gathered there for 2 generations, paddling in the reeds, looking for turtles and crayfish, standing with hundreds of minnows nibbling at our toes. These memories create a deep connection to taking good care of our water systems. And that's just so sweet. And I love that point.
And then, yeah, we also have another person talking about walking down the Edmonton River Valley and how they took a gorgeous family canoe trip from Devon to Fort Edmonton. Lena had kind of talked about her experience in the River Valley in Edmonton, and it is a really beautiful place, and we're really kind of blessed to just be able to experience it. And there's another comment, again, walking the River Valley with the coming seasons and like how they change. It is really beautiful. I love fall time, to be completely honest. That's my favorite time in the River Valley. It's very beautiful and it's great that we can all appreciate it.
Yeah, and our very own Peter said fishing, swimming, canoeing, boating, and sitting on the dock watching the loons at, and I'm so sorry Peter, Kawigomog Lake on the Pickerel River in Northern Ontario. Been there since 1962 and going back this summer. Very exciting. I hope he sends us pictures.
Yeah, and then we have another one where they're talking about they have a piece of waterfront land on the mighty Vermilion River near Vegreville. They've enjoyed canoeing, skating, and swimming a couple of times in the river, and they enjoyed sneaking up on the beavers at night. Man, a lot of mention of beavers, those pesky little things. But last year the river flowed at spring breakup, but then stopped flowing and the levels kept dropping throughout the summer. If it were not for the beaver dams holding the water, the whole river valley would have drained out. Beavers do play a very important role in it though. So yeah, thank you for that comment.
Yeah, lots of hoorays for viewers. It says Linda shared in 1969 when I went from Calgary to Rycroft to teach. I learned that water is scarce for many farms in the Peace River country. We need to recognize that not everywhere has abundant water, and we need to cherish our water sources and not allow corporations to place any contamination in the water. As well, need to end bottled water by corporations. Absolutely. I read somewhere that water bottle corporations just sell plastic bottles, not the water. And I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, next we also have another comment saying, last summer I was prowling around for the nearest non-scummy lake. Many of these lakes within an hour of Edmonton, they remember being lovely to swim and play in as a kid, but are now icky. However, Alberta Beach, which I had, they had scoped out in the winter, turned out to be very lovely, especially during the heat wave. And they made it out multiple times to just walk around and wade into the water and just kind of take in the sensual experience of warmth, water, wind, and sand. And there was a few dead fish due to the warmth, but overall it was a sweet experience. That's lovely to hear. I've never actually been to Alberta Beach, so maybe I'll check it out, but I can't, it sounds lovely.
I'm just looking through some of the other stories. Let's see. I'm gonna see some of the newer messages. Susan says this week is spring breakup on the Battle River, and the ponds on the pastures and fields are now full of migrating birds. So exciting! I saw geese for the first time on campus today. that was an exciting experience, but absolutely.
Yeah, actually speaking of geese, in Red Deer we have like Bower Ponds, and like feeding the geese is like a summertime ritual for like all the young kids. It's actually really cute to see. But we actually do have another comment. It says, oh, right in Edmonton here, the Summerside Lake in my neighborhood. I believe that's in Edmonton here. But it was originally filled with drinking water. It's kind of strange, but I guess resourceful. Use everything that's available to you.
Well, I guess I'm going to have to be the troll under the bridge again here and stop things. I could keep going forever, but whoever wants to stick around, we could read a few more. So now, I believe Peter, this recording, or Christina would be able to tell us how can people get a hold of the recording so they can read the rest of the stories and whatever else they want. A lot of information tonight, fabulous presentations, and thank you all so much for involving yourselves. But how can people get a hold of the recording here, Christina?
Yeah, so we'll be sending the recording out to all of the folks who registered and also to folks who are members of the Council of Canadians. So if you haven't checked out our national website, I would recommend that you do that at canadians.org. You can sign up to be a member for as little as $1 a year, and you get updates on great events like this and recordings of other webinars, analysis pieces, all sorts of really excellent information. So, oops, I did only just sent it to one person. There we go. So yeah, we'll send it out to everyone who's still here and all of the folks registered. And we'd also invite you to join our organization by going to canadians.org.
All right, I'll say goodbye to everybody and hoping to see you out somewhere on a river and hopefully to hear from you again and to join in with us in loving our water and our rivers. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to sign off now and appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.